Hello! If you haven't seen my main channel video about the topic, these are my Kovacs benchmarks. That video goes into why I made them how I did, but the short version is that my goal was to create benches that was just a list of useful scenarios to kind of trick people almost into playing something helpful for their improvement, even if they might not be as good at testing skill as something like Voltaic. But this idea only works if you know how to approach each category in an effective way, which is exactly what I want to go over here. Starting from the top, the first category is control tracking, which is best described as any tracking scenario that requires precise movements on a target that moves in readable but non-linear patterns. The most important part of this category, though, is what happens when the target changes directions. It's gradual. It takes a period of time for the bot to reach its maximum speed, which encourages us to also take our time with our corrections to those direction changes. This is exactly what makes this category so useful for improvement. For the longest time, I've thought that the best way to approach even very challenging, more reactive scenarios was by starting with slow corrections back to the target and only speeding up after developing consistency. And this category is that idea manifested. You have to start out slow and develop those strong foundations for fundamental corrections before speeding up. For high-level players, snappier corrections can be implemented in some scenarios here, but only if you're able to make them consistently. And if you can't, you will realize very quickly because of how heavily inaccuracy in corrections is punished. This category is split into 4 subcategories which focus on different muscle groups: arm, wrist, fingertips, and one final category forcing you to seamlessly merge different groups together. A quick note about fingertip aim here, you don't have to use fingertip grip to utilize it. I kind of think we should create some new type of categorization here because there are sort of 2 types of fingertip aiming. The first is what players like Pinguify implement through smaller mice and grips that lack any kind of palm contact whatsoever, where the fingers are moving with the mouse as they physically drag or push it. The second is where the fingertips appear stationary but are applying force to the mouse. The distinction to be drawn from wrist movements here is where the movement is based. With wrist movements, the wrist moves the fingers. With fingertip-led movements, the fingertips move the wrist. It enables greater precision for those movements than just using your wrist would offer and opens up the potential for better fine control, and is best used to complement larger wrist movements the same way wrist movements are good at complementing larger arm movements. On that note, I have seen some people say things like you want to only use your fingertips on the fingertip subcategory, for example, but this isn't true. The names dictate what the primary muscle group you will rely on for the scenarios will be, but that doesn't mean it's the only one you should use. This applies for basically everything involving muscle groups, by the way. I can't really think of a single aiming scenario that is exclusively one isolated muscle group. Even individual movements are often a blend of both. It's just what drives that movement that changes. And while that driving muscle group does change, the way muscle groups are utilized stays the same throughout the control tracking subcategories. The smaller group starts the movement before the larger one continues it and follows through. Which muscle group is smaller and larger and how much each one does is relative here and will change based on the width of the bot's strafes, but the core idea is always the same. VT Controlsphere shows this nicely, requiring an accurate wrist or fingertip correction which gradually transitions into a wider follow-through with your arm. The blending category takes this idea to its extreme, with single strafes or movements often requiring the use of all 3 muscle groups without noticeable delays when switching between them or even using them simultaneously for different things. This category's stricter focus on muscle groups does have the side effect of placing a greater importance on sensitivity. A scenario like Controlsphere Far kind of breaks at a slow enough sense, which is why for the fingertip subcategory I have a sensitivity rule. For a score for a rank to be considered valid on any of these 3 scenarios, it has to be played at 50 cm per 360 or faster. Anything slower than 50 is where I consider the scenario to shift focus into being more wrist-centric, but in my opinion, if fingertip control is something you struggle with, playing at faster sensitivities will be very beneficial. 50 is just the lower bound. For the other subcategories, I recommend anything between 30 to 50 cm, but there are exceptions. For the arm subcategory, if you're struggling to integrate your arm into your aim, going slower still can force you to learn how to utilize it more, and the same applies with faster sensitivities and fingertip aim, but other than that, it's preference. I play anywhere from 28 to 48 depending on the scenario, and I'll have a full list of what I used for all of my PBs in the description, including other categories as well there, not only control tracking. Next on the list is reactive tracking and features a mix of more traditional reactive gauntlet style scenarios alongside some fairly distinct takes on what reactive even is. And while this looks like an excuse for me to add another Controlsphere scenario into my benchmarks, and it kind of is, I promise this does actually fit the category. The subcategories here are more plainly split into control, speed, and reading. The control scenarios address how consistent and accurate your corrections are while still requiring some level of speed. Speed scenarios require a good level of control to your adjustments at higher speeds, and reading isolates your ability to pick up on the bot's acceleration while needing to make snappier adjustments to more frequent strafes than on reading-focused control tracking scenarios. None of these scenarios are that reactive compared to the likes of LDDH, and that is 100% intentional. In my main channel video, I said that I chose scenario types that have benefited me personally when looking at in-game improvement, and when approaching picking scenarios from that angle, these more manageable reactive scenarios have done far more for my aim in-game than anything like LDDH ever did. Like I said before, even though more of an emphasis has been placed on speed with these scenarios, I still believe the consistency of your adjustments to be the most important skill here. If you are missing the majority of your corrections back to the target, you need to slow down until you've developed the consistency to land them. Controlsphere OW is a great example of this. Despite having control in the name, it flips that category on its head by removing the acceleration time after changing directions. This forces you to go between a high adjustment speed right down to a much slower, more controlled tracking speed seamlessly, and managing that deceleration while maintaining high accuracy is the primary challenge of this scenario. For me, it drew my tension management into a much sharper focus, both from the need for snappier movements overall, but also the increased reliance on my wrist. While it shared the responsibility of micro adjustments with my fingertips, it was almost entirely responsible for follow-throughs here, so I had to be very conscious of my tension to avoid lockout. I tend to play these scenarios at a higher sensitivity compared to control tracking, anywhere from 28 to 35 centimeters per 360, usually anyway, sometimes a bit faster. The flicking technique category is a combination of Pokeball, static, and target switching. These scenario types all improve the same broader skill in different ways, and since their goals are so closely aligned, I think it makes sense to combine them here. The subcategories then further isolate the areas of the flick the scenarios focus on. Speed is fairly self-explanatory. They are the most flicking focused of the flick technique tasks. But similar to the speed subcategory in Reactive, I tried to choose scenarios that force you to push speed in a productive way rather than relying on brute force. Pokeball punishes you for having unstable landings, voxTargetSwitch places a good amount of emphasis on chaining rather than raw speed, and since the targets on 1W 2TS reload are so small, you need to release tension very early in the flick to make accurate and fluid micro adjustments. All of these scenarios need controlled flicks, not just fast ones, so if you are struggling to improve on these, have a think about what other areas of the run you need to work on before trying to flick faster. The speed increase should be a gradual thing, in sync with your increase in control over those flicks that these scenarios will help you develop. Stability shifts that needle over. We're going from fast flicks that need some control to controlled, accurate flicks that need some speed. I think the best way to summarize it is that you need very good chaining, which I just think of as looking at your time to kill across multiple kills instead of any single variable like flicking speed. So someone with faster flicks can still have worse chaining if they miss their flicks and have to micro more often or leave the target slower after getting a kill, for some examples. That also means that the best way to improve your chaining is just to never miss your initial flicks, even if that comes at the cost of some speed. In these scenarios, it's absolutely worth it, and I found that I had to actively think about slowing down slightly to get a higher score. Micro is honestly fairly simple to explain as well. It's the same principle as the speed subcategory, but shifted down to smaller movements. Snappiness and clean flicks are mandatory here, but they have to be made with smaller muscle groups compared to wider movements. Post-flick is one that I'm honestly still not that happy with the name of, but what I mean by it is flicking scenarios that focus on what happens after the flick. Both dummy switch and tam target switch require very high amounts of stability just generally, but these tasks make you exhibit that tracking skill immediately after, making you do a large flick. This once again shifts that needle over. Speed matters less and stability matters more. But the best players are still able to flick very quickly here, and you have to get those very high scores. These scenarios are great at training tension control mid-flick, and I highly recommend playing variants of these if this is something you struggle with. BeanTS Voltaic is a good scenario that fits into this category as well, still forces some tracking but without as heavy an emphasis on it. The next category is dynamic clicking, split into the 3 subcategories of linear, precision, and reading. And actually, I was thinking about swapping the name of linear to leading or placement, since I think either of those more accurately represents the single most important skill in this subcategory, putting your crosshair where the target will be instead of where it is. It's very visible in Vox Click. Flick speed and accuracy matter, of course, but a large part of the skill gap is in reducing the physical gap between where you place your crosshair and where the target is. Matty has a very good video on this concept if you'd like to learn more, but for me, actively focusing on trying to lead my shots, then as I got better, reducing the distance I was leading by was essential for improving in dynamic, and these types of scenarios were fantastic at isolating the skill. Precision click timing is another one of those self-explanatory ones. These scenarios feature fairly small targets making readable but somewhat complex movements. Tasks within the category do differ a fair bit, but as a general rule, I think trying to move your mouse only as much as you have to shines through here. For example, in Passive Angelic, the target strafes are fairly quick but don't cover a lot of distance. Or when WTTS Passive Perfected. The same idea applies there, and the closer to center mass you can aim, the better your odds are of landing your shot. Reading focus click timing also targets precision to an extent, but makes those complex movements much harder to follow visually. While popcorn targets fall in predictable, easy to understand patterns, and the challenge lies in hitting the bot along that predictable arc, here the challenge is part hitting the target and part actually telling what it is going to do. This applies on both a micro and macro scale, with scenarios like Passive featuring bots themselves that are hard to read, whereas Bounce Shot shifts the focus to reading the map as a whole, following a lot of arcs simultaneously in your peripheral vision. After I finished writing this, I realized that I totally forgot to mention in-game translation for any of these because, in my opinion, all of these are useful for training for any game because of how good these scenarios are at building general mouse control. That's also why I'm not going to give control tracking specifically a recommended game because it really is so good for everything. The muscle group isolation it offers is fantastic for every type of aim. Its emphasis on acceleration rating is incredible for any game with it, and it's just really good at improving your fine control. I feel similarly about reactive tracking, but it is certainly more specialized. Air scenarios were personally the foundation of a lot of my aiming skill, but I do know that control tracking could have filled that foundation just as well, if not better, and more reactive scenarios seem to have a narrower focus for games like Overwatch. I've still tried to include scenarios that I find generally useful here, and I don't think they will be bad for a tac shooter player to put time into it, but if Valorant is all you play, for example, your time might be better spent elsewhere. Flicking technique is flicking technique. I think this applies for every game, especially because of its focus on more than just the wide, super flashy flicks. Scenarios like WaldoTS or BeanTS are great for Counter-Strike and Valorant because of how they teach you to better manage tension throughout smaller flicks, the most common type in that genre. Click timing is a scenario type I really should spend more time with because I have a hunch that it's very similar to control tracking, where the skills developed here will translate outwards really, really well. Because of that, I do recommend it for everyone, but especially tac shooter players. These scenarios have helped me so much for Counter-Strike, especially the precision and stability scenarios. I think that's everything though. I hope this has been useful, and thank you all so much for your support on these benchmarks. It's been a long project, but your support and appreciation has made it very, very worth it.